Welcome back to Stories in the Inglenook, Part 4 of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, read from the Usborne Complete Dickens, All the Novels Retold. Join us as we travel back into 19th century London to see what happens to our protagonist, the big-hearted orphan, Oliver Twist. "We need a description of this man, Monks," the gentleman told her. "You can trust us. We will not reveal you, but you must give up Fagin and the others." "Never," Nancy said. "I need you to promise they'll be safe." "Why would you protect them?" the gentleman asked. "I've led a bad life, but none of them have turned on me, bad as they are, so I won't turn on them." "Just give us Monks, then. We won't involve the others." "What if he turns on them when you get him?" Nancy asked. "I promise you that as long as we have the truth from him, then we won't give him to the police," said the old gentleman. "I will not hand anyone else in either, without your permission." Nancy looked at him in silence for a moment. "I've been a liar among liars from a little child," she said, "but I believe you." She told them the name of the public house where Monks could be found, and described him. "He has wild, mad eyes. He can't be more than 26, but he's withered and haggard. On his throat, higher than his neckerchief, he has a wide red mark like a burn or a scald," said Mr. Brownlow suddenly, sounding surprised. "You know him?" cried the girl. "I think so," said the old gentleman. "Now, you have helped us. Let us help you. Take this purse." "No, I didn't do it for money," Nancy protested. "Let me at least have that to think of, that one good thing I did." They pleaded with Nancy to let them help her, but to no avail. And so they thanked her again and went their separate ways. The shadowy figure who had heard it all slipped away back to Fagin's den. Fagin, having witnessed Nancy's increasing disquiet, had sent one of the sneakier boys he employed to spy on her. Long after his spy had returned and told him everything, Fagin sat hunched over a candle, biting his filthy, long fingernails and staring into the flame with bloodshot eyes. Black and evil were his thoughts. He was full of twisted rage at Nancy. She had betrayed them all, and he didn't trust her enough to believe she wouldn't turn them in. He sat like that, unmoving, until he heard someone at the door. He went to answer it and came back with Bill Sikes, fresh from a burglary with a bundle under his arm. "Here, see how much you can get for that," he told Fagin, giving it to him and flinging his burly frame into a chair. "Supposin'," Fagin said to him slowly, "one of mine overheard a conversation where someone had told on us, described us so as we could be turned in. What would you do?" "I'd grind his skull to dust under my boot," Sikes growled. Fagin nodded. "Boulter, wake up," he called to his spy. "Tell Sikes here what you told me about Nancy." Sikes leapt up in a rage when he heard it. "Hell's fire!" "Don't be too violent," whined Fagin. "Don't get us caught." In a murderous rage, the robber hurtled from the room and home to Nancy. Of all the bad deeds that were committed under the cover of darkness in London that night, that was the worst. The sun brought light into the room where Sikes sat at the table, and poor Nancy lay, murdered, on the floor. He hadn't moved since he had done it, but now, as the light streamed in, fear caught up with him. He whistled to his dog, and he left. He left the room, the street, and London. He left it all behind, haunted by Nancy's face, terrified of being caught. He slept in fields and ate in public houses, hearing people talk of a terrible murder committed in London. Poor woman. They're on the hunt for a murderer. Sikes moved on. Back in London, a carriage was drawing up outside Mr. Brownlow's house. Out of it, between 3 strong men, was brought a wild-eyed figure. It was Monks. They took him into the house, sat him down, and looked to Mr. Brownlow for instructions.
"If he refuses to cooperate or lifts a finger against us," Mr. Brownlow said, "drag him into the street and call for the police."
The men released Monks, and he glowered at the old gentleman.
"This is a pretty treatment for my father's oldest friend," he said.
Mr. Brownlow sighed.
"It is because of your dear father and his sister, who died just before she became my wife, that I treat you so gently, Edward Leaford." "What do you want with me?" Monks said. "I want to talk about your brother. Your father's marriage to your mother was an unhappy one. After you had grown up, your mother left him. He met another woman and fell in love. She was pregnant with his child, and he promised to marry her, not revealing the secret that he was already married. When a relative died, leaving him rich, he had to travel to Rome to set his affairs straight and to beg your mother to free him from their marriage. But while he was there, he fell ill and died. There was no will, so all of his money was left to you and your mother."
"And?" said Monks, his eyes shifting nervously.
"Before he went to Rome, he came here to me. He left in my care a portrait of Agnes, the woman he loved. He didn't return." Mr. Brownlow sighed. "When I heard of his death, I tried to find Agnes, but could not. Years later, fortune dropped Agnes's son on my doorstep. He was the image of his mother in the painting. But then he disappeared, and I decided to track you down. I went to the West Indies and back in my efforts, and found out various things. There was a will, but you and your mother destroyed it. However, if proof existed of the child's parentage, he could still inherit his father's money. A condition of the will was that if the child remained good and innocent, unlike his other son, who had already caused him so much pain, then it would inherit the money. Your father was so confident in the child's mother, he was sure any child she had would be pure and good. You evil man, tried your best to have Oliver corrupted. You failed. So, instead, you destroyed the only proof of his identity, and now, as a result of all of this, of your actions, a murder has been committed." "I knew nothing of that," Monks cried, frightened. "Will you sign a confession to the rest, and split the inheritance with Oliver as his right?" Mr. Brownlow said. "Yes, yes." "After you have done it, we need never meet again. I will keep your secret, but if you ever go anywhere near Oliver, I'll show your signed confession to the police," Mr. Brownlow told him.
In the hours that followed, the criminals were flushed out of their dens like rats from holes and hunted through London. The artful dodger found himself in a courtroom charged with pickpocketing. The police officer indignantly reported that he had seen him take a handkerchief out of a gentleman's pocket, blow his nose, and return it before stealing a pocket watch instead. The dodger, still his jaunty self, sauntered out of court to be deported as a criminal to Australia. On the River Thames, in the filthiest, poorest, meanest place, there were some derelict buildings on an inlet that flooded at high tide. In the dingiest, dampest, boarded-up house, some of the remaining thieves were holed up.
Baggins been taken. It says in the papers, is that true? Asked Toby Crackit. Yep, they'll hang him, came the reply. Sykes' dog jumped in through a gap in the boarded window, and they all quivered when Sykes arrived shortly after. Charlie Bates eyed Sykes fearfully. You monster, he muttered. I'll have nothing to do with you. If they come, I'll give you up. Sykes grabbed him by the throat and squeezed, but at that moment there came a hammering. Open up in the king's name! Help! Yelled Charlie Bates. He's in here! Sykes dropped him and said, Give me a rope. I'll escape from the roof. I can let myself down and swim for it if the tide's in. He ran to the top of the house and climbed out of the window onto the roof. But the tide was out. A crowd had gathered below this time, and they watched as he hesitated. Then, determined to make a last attempt to escape, he slung one end of the rope around the chimney. He tied a loop in the other, meaning to slip it around his waist, lower himself down, and make a run for it. He slipped the loop over his head, but before he could bring his arms through, he lost his footing and fell. There was a sudden jerk as he came to the end of the rope, and the noose tightened sharply around his neck. He hung there, twitching, a knife clutched in his stiffening hand. His white dog, which had followed him onto the roof, gave a dismal howl and leapt to his master. It missed and, plummeting down, knocked its head on a stone below, and was killed too. A few days later, Oliver and his friends gathered in the place of his birth, and they told him everything they'd found out. He listened, tears coursing down his cheeks as he learned of his father's love for his mother. And your dear mother Agnes had a little sister, Mr. Brownlow finished. When her parents died a while later, the little girl was brought up by her loving aunt. He placed his hand on Rose Maylie's arm. Oliver, this is your aunt. Oliver threw his arms around Rose, who kissed him tenderly. My own dear Rose, I loved you from the beginning, Oliver said. There remains little to tell. Mr. Brownlow adopted Oliver as his own son, and they moved to a house in the countryside, close by the Maylies, and the little group's happiness, from that moment on, was as near to perfect as is possible in this changing world. This concludes our story of Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Thank you for listening.